Welcome to my presentation. I'm actually calling it Being the Change, Trauma and Resilience in Anti-Trafficking Work. Just a bit of a warning, this presentation may be a little bit confronting, but I hope at the very least it's resonating with you. I'm going to be talking about some confronting ideas and concepts. So please keep an open mind as I try to explain the subject matter. So what do I mean by being the change? What I mean is that sometimes in anti-trafficking work, we need to be the change we want to see. Sometimes that's easier said than done. So a little bit about me. I run an organization called Embode. It's an international human rights consultancy. We provide NGOs, UN agencies, corporate entities with consultancy on various issues of human rights, but in particular on issues of labor exploitation, child exploitation, as well as on issues of forced labor and trafficking. We also work on organizational analysis, which is where we look at internal organizational cultures and processes, particularly in NGOs, and provide capacity building on leadership. We're based in Asia. We've worked across 12 countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. And a little bit about me. I've been working in anti-trafficking for over 18 years in local and international NGOs in Asia, as well as back in my home country, the UK, in government law enforcement, and most recently in private sector and corporate supply chains. So I've had the privilege of working on anti-trafficking and issues of labor exploitation across a number of different perspectives, countries, and contexts. I've had an interest in looking at the internal side of organizations as we do the work out there on anti-trafficking. It's been an interesting journey, and it's from my work, my research, that I'm presenting some of my thoughts today. So what is this presentation about? My theory, what I propose, my working hypothesis, is that anti-trafficking work, or indeed any work that seeks to protect people from abuse and violence, carries with it a social hazard. And that is that organizations that do this kind of work are vulnerable to experiencing the same or similar dynamics of abuse and exploitation that they are seeking to respond to in the context, in their communities, within their organization. So what I mean to say is that in the work of anti-trafficking, in the work against violence and issues of abuse, we may unconsciously experience some of these dynamics ourselves or on our organizations. And this is something I see commonly repeated across the sector, across different parts of the world, and it can have tragic consequences. So in this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about that trauma, about how and why it happens, and what we can do to practice that resilience, to practice that strength, and become more conscious, both in our organizations and in our roles. So I'd like to give some examples of how we might experience that trauma in our organizations. These are examples that I have taken from my research, and some of them are also ones that I have experienced myself, unfortunately. You may resonate with some of them, so please keep an open mind. One example is of a women's rights organization that campaigns for women's rights all over the world, but has no effective maternity leave policy for its own staff. Some other examples I've seen are of victim protection organizations that unfairly use its beneficiaries to raise funds and its organizational profile. Obviously, to some extent, you know, NGOs need to profile their own work to raise funds. But I think there is a line between unfairly using beneficiaries and fairly using beneficiaries. I have also, unfortunately and tragically, come across instances of abuse that take place within shelters and centres that are dedicated to victim protection, thereby actually doing the opposite of what they're purporting to do. And I've also experienced and witnessed whole projects and organizations being destroyed or being unjustly defunded by donors, by governments, as a political decision, you know, at the end of the day. As you can imagine, you know, these examples can produce awful consequences, both for the organization and their staff. Some other examples and case studies are where particular roles that people take up, such as the person that's representing victims' rights, the person that's in the role of a gender-based violence officer, will experience undue and unfair harassment while they're doing their role. Sometimes that harassment can even be gender-based abuse or other types of abuse. And this is something that happens more often than we'd like to admit. Unfortunately, I do see a lot of children's rights organizations that, although they advocate for the rights of children, including the right to a child to family life, do not really, in their behavior and their practices, support their own staff to maintain a healthy work-life balance. And in many cases, I've also seen people working for these organizations unable to sustain a healthy family life. And unfortunately, I've also seen instances of where labor rights organizations working in the area of migrant labor, anti-trafficking, may be due to funding reasons or insufficient resources, inordinately rely on voluntary workers, interns, volunteers, or lower paid staff, and it goes beyond what is reasonable. And in some cases, and in many cases, particularly for example in Thailand, we see often organizations aren't able to give their own workers work permits. So in some ways, they may unconsciously, inadvertently recreate some of the very dynamics that we're seeing, in the field. And of course, the impacts and implications of these are significant. They can undermine the very purpose and the objective of the organization. They can mirror the very dynamic the organization is responding to, leaving workers and staff feeling incredibly confused and sometimes traumatized. It can recreate feelings of the experience of marginalization and discrimination. And of course, it can lead to emotional pain, trauma, and also a loss of resources for the organization when this starts impacting staff leaving the organization, or impacting the reputation and credibility of your organization. So why does this happen and how does it happen? I just want to, this is I did a 3-year master's program on this, and I've been studying this for 8 years. But in this very couple of minutes, I just want to give you a short synopsis of psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory says that all of us human beings have a conscious and an unconscious. And in very simple terms, our unconscious is those parts of our psyche, those parts of our internal reality and our belief systems that we are not aware that we have. We can understand our unconscious by observing our behaviors and our patterns. And I'll give you one example. I may have an unconscious belief that I cannot trust anybody. I may not realize that I have this belief, but because I do have it, I behave with everybody as if I don't trust them. And because I behave as if I don't trust people, it actually recreates situations which strengthen my belief of why I shouldn't trust people, rather than, you know, looking for information, experiences, and data that might contradict that belief. I usually only focus on those things that might tell me why I shouldn't trust people. So this is an example of an unconscious belief that I may not be aware of. But if you are my friend or if you are my colleague, you will see me behaving like this, and you will realize that I have an unconscious belief system. Now, when we have groups and teams, we may share an unconscious belief system. And we can see this when we pay attention to our experiences, the actions, interesting patterns of behavior, and coincidences. When whole groups and teams and organizations behave in a particular way, it becomes a culture of our team. It becomes a unique culture of our organization. And I'm sure you have experienced ways in which different organizations, you know, have different cultures. We see it even with businesses. Even when we go to one restaurant or another restaurant, we see the atmosphere amongst the staff, the culture can be very different. So we recreate those within our teams. Now, parallel processes is something I would like to explain to you. If we all have an unconscious, these are the feelings and emotions that we have that we're not aware of. But sometimes we can pick up and feel the emotions of other people. For example, do you sometimes feel that, you know, when your child is sad or upset or not feeling well, or might your child pick up on your feelings? This is actually, or sometimes you may think about your friend and your friend calls you at that very moment. These are examples of a pre-verbal communication where you can feel the emotions of other people. It's actually something that animals still do, and something that human beings still do. And it's something from our evolution. So it's from our reptilian parts of our brain, and an ability that we had before our prefrontal cortex, you know, evolved and we became, you know, these kind of big-brained human beings. But we still have this ability to pick up the feelings of others. And as individuals, we may therefore communicate our feelings, and thereby our unconscious feelings, and thereby help to recreate the very dynamics that we think we are experiencing. I'll give you the example. Now, if I'm an individual that has an unconscious belief that I don't trust anybody, and I come to you and I'm behaving with you as if I don't trust you, then it can, in many cases, recreate that feeling in you that, you know, you feel that, you know, I can't trust you. And it creates a feeling, and it creates a dynamic, recreates a dynamic that I shouldn't trust people. Maybe you do something, you know, that upsets me, and I think, see, I shouldn't trust you. So as individuals, we tend to recreate dynamics around us. We tend to recreate dynamics in our relationships, different relationships, and in different situations. And these might be called parallel processes. This is what psychoanalysis calls parallel processes. Now, what I propose and what has been written about is that parallel processes can also occur across groups and organizations. The same way that I have a tendency to recreate a particular dynamic wherever I go with different people in different jobs, in different situations, organizations can also experience parallel processes from the very contexts they work in. If an organization is working in the field of abuse and exploitation, it needs to be very aware of this potential for the process in those dynamics, in those communities, in those situations to be recreated within your organization, because you are interacting directly with that dynamic. So it can therefore be recreated, because we are social animals. We are social beings as human beings. And we're not individuals, we're not islands. Our psyches and our consciousnesses are interconnected. So if we can become aware of this, if we can become aware of parallel processes, we can become resilient and we can become conscious. Parallel processes are actually used by therapists and psychoanalysts as a form of communication. Because if we see a dynamic recreating itself here, we're able to make the transformation here in order to make the transformation out there, because everything is connected. I hope I'm making sense there. What I'm trying to say is that if we see a parallel process being recreated here, but is actually from over there, making the transformation over here can impact a transformation out there. This is what I mean by being the change you want to see. This is the way in which a crisis can become an opportunity for transformation. So I just want to talk in the last 5 minutes or so about how we can practice resilience in organizations. Now, I'm going to go really fast over something that we can go, in fact, incredibly in depth in, but I'm just going to give you a few tips and practices that you can adopt immediately within your organizations that can help you build this resilience. So how to practice and build organizational resilience. What I mean by organizational resilience is building organizational consciousness. It's about taking your organization on a journey that brings more awareness and light and consciousness in the way that we experience our work. And we can do this through practices, processes, and procedures. What we need to be cognizant of is that these can take place at a very personal level, at a role level, at a team level, and at an organizational level. What's really important is to pay attention to boundaries. Boundaries might be defined as those lines across which differentiation is identified. There's a difference between me and you, and our personal identities have a boundary. Other boundaries to pay attention to are around task, time, and territory. When something ends, when something starts, what is my task? What is your task? Where should this task take place? At the office or at home? These are important differentiations and boundaries to be aware of. Always practice the idea that there is an opportunity in every crisis. Really adopting the belief that you can be the change you want to see in others. And these are really important. So at the level of your person, at a personal level, how can you better manage yourself to become more conscious on behalf of your organization and your role? First of all, it's incredibly important to maintain a healthy work-life balance. It's when we don't have this balance that we can become burnt out and vulnerable to these dynamics taking place at work, and of course being in situations that are emotionally upsetting. So very important to maintain and support a healthy work-life balance for yourself and for others. Try to avoid working outside of normal office hours and healthy working habits. Obviously spend personal time in healthy pursuits. Prioritize your rest and recuperation. Take your weekends. Focus on a growth mindset. The more you're able to evolve yourself, the more you're able to practice this brain muscle on behalf of your organization. And understand that you play different roles in your life. You play the role of mother or father at home. You play the role of manager or officer at work. and you have played different roles in your previous, before your current role, you've had past roles. All of these roles affect you as a person and differentiate between what you were in your past organization and how that might be influencing your current organization. Be aware of whether you might be recreating some of the experiences that you are seeing in your life pattern. So this is at the personal level, do your personal work. At the level of role, it's really important to understand the difference between you as a person and you in your role. It's fundamentally important. At all times, be conscious of the way you're navigating and negotiating your boundaries around your role. What time has been set, not just for your working hours, but what time has been set for a meeting? What time has been set to write a report? What is your task and what is somebody else's task? Very often in NGOs and organizations, I see people doing 3 different jobs, either because other people haven't been recruited for those tasks, or because the other people that are supposed to do those jobs aren't doing them very well. Now, one of the things I see, which I have said very often, is that if you are doing the job of somebody else, if you are over-functioning in your role, you are actually strengthening the dysfunction in your organization. If you are over-functioning in your role and doing the job of 3 people, you are enabling the dysfunction in your organization. You are actually making the organization more inefficient and more ineffective because you're hiding the fact that part of it is not functioning very well. Sometimes you have to allow it to dysfunction so that there is a more organizational awareness that something isn't working right. So this is a very responsible way of managing yourself in your organizational role. Territory is about where do you work? It's been agreed that you will work here or over there. It's just another way of navigating and negotiating boundaries. And there's lots of other examples that I can give. Learn about the history of the role that you are in and whether it's influencing your role. Sometimes past experiences of the role before you were even in it may influence the way that you are experiencing the role. It may be that somebody previously in your role had a particular experience of that role, as well as other people in the organization had an experience of that role. And they are influencing the way that you are taking up your role right now. And this is the difference between inner and outer role. You will have your inner idea of what your job is about, but other people will have their own idea about how you should be doing your job. Your job is to distinguish between what you think your work is and what other people think their work is, and finding a middle ground, because roles belong to the organization. You are a person, you fill that role, but that role belongs to the organization. And so the experience you're having in that role is an organizational experience. It's not just a personal experience. It's really helpful to debrief with your boss, with your manager, or even with a consultant, a coach, about how you're experiencing your role, the dynamics that you're experiencing. In teams and systems, it's really important to have a regular space in which, even like a meeting agenda point, where you take time to reflect and identify any patterns and systemic behaviors and interpret, what they may mean. It may be as innocuous as, one person constantly coming late to a meeting. After a while, it becomes a pattern. What's that saying about the organization? What's it saying about the team? Is it that the team is resisting what that person, the role represents coming into the meeting? What part of it is difficult for the team or for the organization to process? Regularly debrief after significant events. For example, the team may often go out to do field work, to do research, to talk to victims, to talk to workers in the field. It's really important to have regular team debriefings about the experiences that staff are having when they go outside, particularly when they go outside of the organization. Pay attention to any anxiety that any team member is experiencing. Anxiety held in one person is often anxiety held by the team or the system. It should not just be seen as that person's problem. It may be seen as the group's anxiety. So it should always be considered and paid attention to. And also notice whether any person or particular role is being scapegoated. Scapegoating meaning is being blamed for all the problems. You know, it's all his fault or all her fault. These kinds of dynamics can be particularly destructive. And if they're not paid attention to as a team, as a group, they can have big consequences. So explore the team and the organizational boundaries. You know, how do the team behave around, you know, going home after work, going outside and meeting other organizations, how the team is meeting people of other teams. That can tell you a lot about how the team is being, your team or your organization is being experienced by others, as well as how your organizational team is experiencing those others. This is really important as part of reflection. It can give you a lot of clues about some of the unconscious or parallel processes that are going on. I've gone over some very challenging concepts, but really what we're talking about is building conscious organizations. Conscious organizations work at the very edge of transformation. A learning organization focuses on growing systemic awareness. There's no such thing as a mistake. There is only learning. Conscious organizations interpret interpersonal dynamics as a function of the system, not of the individuals. Conscious organizations practice healthy management of boundaries. Conscious organizations interpret parallel processes as a communication. Conscious organizations be the change they want to see. Thank you so much for your time. I've gone a bit over and I apologize for that, but I'm happy to answer any questions or discussions. Thank you.